Hello and welcome to my presentation. This is Navigating Education in Rural Alaska. For my paper, I decided I wanted to explore education in Alaska. This is near and dear to my heart because I am a first grade teacher in the Matanuska-Susitna School District. Traditionally, Native Alaskans learn by doing. They learn by experience and involvement in what they are learning. It is customary to be a part of what you are learning. It's not necessarily just sitting in a classroom and being lectured to, or um, what we really consider in Western education. It's really about the experience and passing down that knowledge. There's a great quote from the paper Barnhart and Coagley wrote explaining how it is kind of different from what we traditionally know, and that is their traditional education processes were carefully constructed around observing natural processes, adapting modes of survival, obtaining subsistence from the plant and animal world, and using natural materials to make their tools and implements. Their education was solely based on their survival. It wasn't to go to college or to have a profitable career. It was everything that you needed to know to be able to survive on a daily basis and to survive over the winter. The objectives and the expectations were completely different from what Western education is and what was created when America purchased Alaska. Upon purchase of Alaska, the United States created missions and boarding schools to change the Native Alaskan people into, quoted, civilized Christian Americans, unquote, and that's from Dementi, Leonard, and Gilmore. They also state that the U.S. was intentionally committing cultural genocide. With these boarding schools, there's a long history of negative experiences, and Diane Hirschberg goes in and looks at these experiences, but also found out that there were a lot of positive experiences. So she refers to these as the good, the bad, and the long-lasting effects of these boarding schools. So some of the positive experiences that Native Alaskans recounted from the boarding schools were that the teachers had high expectations for them and they supported them to meet those expectations. They also had the chance to participate in extracurricular activities. They had the opportunity to learn about the outside world and make friends all over Alaska. And then some also attribute their self-discipline, self-sufficiency, and independence to their time at boarding schools. Some of the negative experiences that were recounted explained experiences of physical abuse, such as whippings, sexual abuse and harassment, and emotional abuse where they were maybe shamed or humiliated. One boarding school in particular, the Wrangell Institute, this boarding school had a particularly bad reputation. Diane Hirschberg quotes it saying it had a concentration camp-like atmosphere, and she also quotes, "They compared it to a concentration camp. 4 participants told us they felt the educators at Wrangell were trying to take their culture away and turn them into white people. Rather than talk about graduating from Wrangell, 4 respondents talked about surviving the institute," unquote. And this really goes towards the long-lasting effects that Hirschberg also talks about. She states that a lot of Native Alaskans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, social phobias, emotional scars. There is a difficulty integrating back into the family and community once they were finished at the boarding schools. There was a loss of identity and language and culture. And that's something that we've looked at in this class. We've looked at how Native cultures are losing the language and losing their traditional culture. And the boarding schools were really a huge part of this because they were literally trying to create cultural genocide. They were making this language and this culture go extinct because these students weren't allowed to speak in their native language. They would be whipped if they spoke in their native language. It just wasn't a conducive learning atmosphere. Although there the positive aspects of it, overall it's seen as a negative period in history, especially for education. Along with the idea of cultural genocide uh, that Dementi Leonard and Gilmore spoke about, Jester also presents the idea of the civilization savagism paradigm. And I quote, "This paradigm aimed to erase Indian identity by eliminating external symbols of tribal attachment and replace their tribal identity with the values and behaviors of civilized society. The educational strategies that promoted the civilization savagism paradigm included A. The location of the school, B. A comprehensive educational program, and C. Indoctrination in the essence of the civilization savagism paradigm." These ideas were really leading education in Alaska until the 1970s. So that whole period is education that is trying to extinct a culture. And it wasn't until the 1970s when legislation was passed to where communities were allowed to build public schools in their village as long as they had enough students to support it. And I believe the number of students was about 10. So they needed 10 kids in that community to be able to support a village school. With the transition from boarding schools to public schools in the village, there was still a lot of hostility and animosity towards public schools and westernized education. And in my interview with Melanie Reddington, she briefly spoke about this and how it was present in her village, Manly Hot Springs, saying that there was a disinterest in education and there wasn't a value for it because of what these elders in the village had experienced in their time at the boarding schools. So there was a lack of interest in the public schools that were going into these villages. Today, rural Alaska is using Western curriculum and Western materials in the school districts of rural Alaska. So there are 54 school districts across all of Alaska. That includes the urban and the rural districts. And those are all under the umbrella of the Department of Education for the state of Alaska and the federal government. And rural Alaskan villages are facing the same challenges that urban Alaskan cities and cities all over the United States are facing. They are trying to be successful under the No Child Left Behind Act, and this has been a struggle for cities and towns all over the United States. It's not because of the rural part of it that students or school districts or schools may be struggling. Another challenge facing rural Alaskan school districts and schools are the large number of Title I schools. Now, Title I means that schools get extra funding from the federal government because they are lower social economic status. That means that the student population is the majority of low-income families. And this, again, is not just rural communities. This is urban communities. This is all over the United States. We have Title I schools that need extra funding and that need extra support for their students to be successful. Now, a particularly challenging thing that rural Alaskan school districts are facing that you don't really see in urban communities is the teacher turnover rate. And this is a big issue because children need consistency. That is one of their biggest needs to be successful. They need consistency. And teacher turnover rates are very high in Bush, Alaska. Teachers will typically come in and teach for a year or two and then leave. And that is one of the issues that is facing the Bush and needs to be addressed, because it's hard for children to learn when a teacher comes in, changes everything, and then the next year another teacher comes in, changes everything, and the expectations and consistency are not there. Another factor that is challenging is all over Alaska there is a new accountability system coming down the line, and this is going to hold teachers accountable, and it's a new assessment process for teachers. And so that is going to have an effect on what is being taught and how it's being taught in rural and urban schools. And Alaska has also adopted the new Alaska standards, but then they're also in transition to the Common Core standards. So this will also affect what is being taught and how it's being taught, and if it's meeting the needs of the students. And ultimately, that is the big question. Is Western curriculum meeting the needs of Native Alaskan children in rural Alaska? And Barnhart and Coagley, excuse me, I probably butchered his name, address this issue by stating, I quote, "The complexities that come into play when two fundamentally different worldviews converge present a formidable challenge. The specialization, standardization, compartmentalization, and systemization that are inherent features of most Western bureaucratic forms of organization often are in direct conflict with social structures and practices of indigenous societies, which tend toward collective decision-making, extended kinship structures, ascribed authority vested in elders, flexible notions of time and traditions of informality in everyday affairs. It is little wonder, then, that formal education structures in which often epitomize Western bureaucratic forms have been found wanting in addressing the educational needs of traditional societies." And so that is what is really the big issue, is Western education meeting the needs of rural students and Native Alaskan students. In my interviews with Melanie Reddington and Carol Wiltman, we discussed whether Western curriculum does meet the need of Native Alaskan children in rural communities. And both of them stated that there needs to be a balance between the two different kinds of education. So teachers need to take into consideration the cultural differences of their students and incorporate the traditional ways of knowing and the traditional education that the elders pass down from generation to generation, but then also incorporate the new formal education and Western education. So those are my thoughts and ideas and the research that I found about education in Alaska. I hope this has been interesting and enlightening, and thank you for listening.